This is Dear Strategy, episode 124. Welcome to another episode of Dear Strategy, where we answer all of your questions about product and business strategy. Real questions from real people in real companies, just like yours. Welcome back, strategy creators, to another great episode. This is episode 124. Today, we're going to feature another strategy question, our standard format. As you know, this year, we have been playing around with different formats. Every other episode, we do a strategy question, which we've been doing for several years now. And then we've been sprinkling in these strategy stories every other episode just to kind of see how that format works. But we'd love to hear from you as we go into 2021, which is right around the corner here. We want to try and see, is this format working for you? Do we want to change it up? What do we want to do? So give us a shout out. Let us know what you think. You can go to dearstrategy.net, click on the contact link, and give us some feedback. You could also there ask a question to be featured on the show, share a story, anything you want. We would love to hear from you and let us know that you are out there. Okay, with all that said, let's go ahead and get to today's question, because this is something that has been honestly bugging me for some period of time, or at least some part of this question. Probably going to use a part of it to vent some of these things out that's been on my mind. So let me get into it and I'll explain what I mean. So the question is, Dear Strategy, how can we measure the success of our strategy using some KPI other than orders? And how do we learn from our failures? All right. So this whole question pretty much has to do with measuring your strategy. And there's two places where this comes into play. One place, of course, is in setting the goals that you want to accomplish with your strategy, which kind of falls towards the middle, even beginning part of that process, right? You have to have some goal that you're going after, some objective, and we'll talk about all those definitions in a minute. And then you build a strategy to be able to achieve that, right? So that's one way that you can measure your success, is saying, are we achieving those goals? But then there's another piece to this puzzle, which is the actual results that you get, which are not necessarily going to meet up with the goals and objectives that you put forward. And so there's this results part of your strategy process that we need to talk about as well. But before we get to all of that, I have to clear up some definitions because there's a lot of them. And in this question, what's referenced is this terminology KPI, which stands for Key Performance Indicators. And then I've already referenced some other, types of measurements, goals, objectives, results, right? And so all of these things are out there, and sometimes it gets a little bit confusing. So I want to clear that up and then kind of talk to the question specifically. So, in order, when we're talking about ways to measure your strategy, I'm going to start with something we didn't mention yet, which is the vision, right? So the vision is generally the big goal that you want to accomplish, the big long-term, how do you want to change the world? How do you want to change the way your customers behave? What is it that you want to accomplish? Big, big, big picture, right? And that is the guidepost for your entire strategy. It is a form of goal, but it's very, very fuzzy, and it's fuzzy by design because you're not trying to have anything very, very specific there. You need to give yourself flexibility throughout your strategy to be able to change that up a little bit, right? So the vision is big, it's broad. And as a result, we're going to kind of take that off the table, but it is important because the other things we'll talk about, which are goals, objectives, results, and so forth, those all have to tie back to that vision. All right. So we'll just keep that in mind. So then the next layer of definition that we'll talk about as far as measurement are your goals. Okay. Now your goals, for lack of a better term, they're still big. And in some cases, they're still a bit fuzzy, right? But what they are is a bit of a more granular view of what you want to accomplish in order to achieve your vision. So if your vision is 10 years out, you might have goals that are shorter term. And by shorter term, I mean, 3 years, 5 years, even less than that if you want. But these are almost milestones on the way to your vision, right? Then the next level below that, you would typically have what we refer to as objectives, all right? And objectives, just like the word implies, are the objects of your goals, right? So now these become the measurable things that you want to achieve that indicate that you're accomplishing your goals. And then the last layer of that are the actual results that you get. And the results are the things that you actually do achieve that you can compare back to your objectives and to your goals and to your vision to see if you're on track, off track, and then go ahead and refresh your strategy accordingly. Now, there's one other thing that's the one that's mentioned in the question, which are KPIs or key performance indicators. A lot of people will mix those up with results or objectives. What key performance indicators are the way that you want to measure. It doesn't necessarily have a number associated with it. These are the actual measurements. So when choosing your objectives or tracking your results, right, what you're trying to do is say, what are the most important measurements for my business? All right. And those are what form your KPIs. So you're not necessarily assigning a number to it until you turn it into an objective or a result. What you're really doing is you're choosing what are the most important metrics that you want to track, and then you're going to put objectives and track results against that. Okay. So I know that's a lot, but let's go ahead and do a little bit of an example. So let's say that I have a vision to cure cancer, right? I want to cure cancer. That's my vision. Big, undefined as to how I'm going to do it, anything like that. Seems almost unattainable, right? Although I hope someday that it is attainable. But you get what I mean. It's very aspirational, probably way more than 5 years in the future. But that's my vision. That's what I'm striving towards, okay? Now, I might have several goals that I want to achieve in order to achieve that vision. So one of those goals might be, I want to become a doctor, right? And I'm being personal here, but that might be one of the goals. And there's probably many, many other goals that would go along with that. But let's just take that one, for example, and use it. I want to become a doctor. So that's my goal. So you could see how it's still broad. It's not well defined as to what the measurements are or anything else, but it is definitely more granular than the vision. Okay. So now when we get down to the objective level, what objectives are going to look like, these are going to be the individual measurable components of that larger goal. So again, the larger goal, becoming a doctor. Now I'm going to have several measurable components of becoming that doctor. So I might define things like how much I want to spend on my education, or when I want to graduate, or when I actually want to become a doctor. So these are going to be measurable components of my goal. Now, I'm still not defining which school I want to go to. I'm not defining my specialty. I'm not talking about the how yet, because the how is going to be defined by your strategy. And frankly, this is where a lot of people get tripped up, because when you start developing measurable components of your goal, it's perfectly natural to start thinking about, well, how am I actually going to do that? Because that would kind of talk to how I'm going to measure it as well. That's okay, right? I'm not going to say that there's got to be a very clear line there, but as much as you can separate the what from the how, that's just going to give you more flexibility when you get down to creating your actual initiatives, right? So try and do that as much as possible. But no matter what you do here, the main thing you're trying to get at is to turn your higher level goal into some measurable components that you can track along the way and that you can build strategies to in order to indicate that you're achieving your goal. Now, if we get down to the results, once we've now defined our initiatives and how we're going to achieve our objectives, the results are actually what we achieve, okay? And we can look at those versus the objectives and see where the gaps are, and then go ahead and refresh that. And the KPI, by the way, is whatever the metrics are that I chose to track my business and set my objectives. So if one of the metrics was how much I'm going to spend, that's the KPI. The KPI isn't necessarily the dollar amount that I set as my objective. It's the fact that I set how much I want to spend as one of the ways I want to track my strategy. Okay, so that's the whole thing. Now, there are a few frameworks that muddy up these definitions a little bit. And one of the most popular ones is this framework called OKRs, right? Which stands for objectives and key results. So there's some history to that. And, it's used very heavily in the tech world. So I can tell you when I work with digital companies and so forth, some number of them are already familiar with and sometimes utilizing this OKR thought process. In reality, the structure is exactly the same as what I just talked about, right? But the definitions are a little bit different. In the OKR theory, objectives are more defined as what I would consider to be goals, kind of like the higher level, not necessarily measurable components of your goal. And then the key results are more what I defined as objectives, right? Which are the key results you want to achieve. These are the measurable components. And in the OKR theory, they actually muddy these up with the initiatives as well. So these are the steps you want to take and the results you're going to get. It's all the same basic stuff, so I'm not against it. But I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of the definitions that were put behind it, right? Because to me, when you're talking about objectives being fuzzier, that just doesn't match the definition of what I think an objective is. An objective, like I say, it's supposed to be data-driven, right? It's supposed to be the object of something else. And so to call an objective something that's kind of like higher level and fuzzy, whatever else, that doesn't really work for me personally, right? And then when we think about key results, to me, a result is something that you actually achieve. In this case, they're talking about, something that you're wanting to achieve. So that to me isn't a result. That's a desire, right? Which to me fits more the definition of an objective. So, I tend much more towards the traditional strategic terminology where the goal is the higher level, the objective is the measurable component, and then the results are what you actually achieve. And in my process, I actually have almost a third layer, which is, projected results, perfectly natural to say, here are the results that I think I'm going to get. And I call those projected results. But when you talk about key results, to me, that's something that we're achieving. That's something that we've gotten. So I'm just not a huge fan of it. I'm not going to lie. Now, it's very, very popular, especially in big tech companies. So, a lot of people would probably argue with me and say, you can't possibly be right, Bob. But I'm not saying I'm right or wrong. I'm just saying, to me, those definitions don't resonate quite as much as the traditional definitions. However, I'm not sure that any of it really matters because all of it is the same process and the same structure where you have some higher level goal, you have some measurable component, and then you actually achieve something. So whatever you call it, whatever formula you want to use, as long as you have those components to it, and you have those steps to it, I think it's all good. So with that out of the way, let's actually answer the question. And the question is, how do we measure the success of our strategy using some measurement other than orders? And then how do we learn from our failures? So here's what I would say to this specific question is that if you're asking this question about one specific measurement, you probably haven't followed this process to come up with why that measurement is important. And orders happens to be a really good example of this because I could have 1 million orders, but I can be selling my product at, a negative margin, which means orders is not going to matter a hill of beans, right? It doesn't make a difference at that point because I'm not profitable unless my goal was somehow to just get a lot of orders, right? In which case maybe it would make sense. But it sounds like that's not the case here. It sounds like orders is disconnected from the rest of the process, or at least we don't know why orders is important. And this, by the way, is pretty common, right? A lot of times companies will skip the strategic process, just go right into an annual budgeting or annual planning process, and then choose which measurements or KPIs they want to track their business with. But there's no strategy behind them. So then when you're missing a measurement or you're missing one of the metrics, instead of going back to the strategy and saying, what failed in the strategy that caused us not to meet this metric, you just try and correct the metric, right? And say, I'm not getting enough orders, so I got to go get more orders and scurry around and try and do that. Whereas if that was actually tied to a strategic process, you would know why orders was chosen as a measurement. You would know what goal is behind that. You would know what initiatives are behind that. And then you'd be able to look at what initiatives are not working. And that's what you would correct, right? But if you don't have any of that, then you're just going to try and reactively correct the number of orders without any strategy behind it. And that becomes a big problem. So by following this process that I gave you, and the reason I gave you all these definitions and all of this framework is because that's the answer to the question, right? Is make sure that every KPI you have is tied back to some objective, to some goal, and that all of that is tied to some initiatives. Those are the things that you want to correct. And then instead of learning from your failures that I just didn't meet a number, you're learning what initiatives didn't work and why they didn't work. And that's what you seek to correct. Okay. So that's why all of this is important. So you see, I knew I'd get around to answering the question eventually. There is a method to my madness, but it really is important to understand all of these different definitions and have this framework in place, because for any strategic process, that's what keeps all of these measurements and all of these results from just being, results. Instead, you want them to be tied back to a strategy, and then you're measuring the success of the strategy instead of the success of a number. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully that gave you some insight that you didn't have before. Again, please go out to dearstrategy.net and we'll have the blog that goes along with this post. I know I put a lot of things, threw a lot of things at you. So all of that will be clarified in the blog. While you're there, again, get in touch with us. And while you're there, you could also link back to Strategy Generation Company. We can help you with all of this. And Strategy Generation Company is the company that I founded, the company that I own, and the company that sponsors this podcast. And we provide tools and training and workshops and all kinds of things that help you and your team to get through this exact process and get through some of these muddied definitions. So definitely give us a shout. Go to strategygeneration.com, see some of the things that we have to offer, and hopefully we can help your business to grow. And while you're doing all that, please don't forget to make time for the plan. And we'll see you back here on another episode of Dear Strategy. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for listening to Dear Strategy with Bob Caporelli. To learn more or to submit a question to be featured on our show, please visit us at dearstrategy.net.